Okay, we're continuing. This is part 3, Quotes of Goethe, from this book here, Holy Grail of Wisdom Quotes. First thing, Goethe, he's the great German writer, kind of like what Shakespeare was to England, Goethe is to Germany. Objects in a picture should be arranged to tell a story. Yeah, that's partly why paintings like the one right behind me, The School of Athens by Raphael, are so great. By the way, Goethe thought Raphael was the greatest painter of all time. Shakespeare was the greatest writer of all time, for example. What is classical is healthy. What is romantic is sick. So Goethe lived through several different phases. He was sort of born, and his youth was through what you might call the Enlightenment, which was kind of dominated by the French. Okay, and it was also a form of classicism or French neoclassicism with painters like Jacques Louis David, painting the French Revolution and all of that in a very sort of serious phase. And it looked back primarily to the ancient Greeks. That's classicism, the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. And they sort of felt that the ancient Greeks were these geniuses and they could only try to emulate them. They could never be as good as them. Okay, and that nature should be controlled. There was sort of this mentality of tremendous optimism. And then later on, Romanticism, there was more pessimism. There was more pessimism, the idea that nature was out of control. In addition, Romanticism looked back a little bit more to the Middle Ages, like King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, like Christianity. It was a bit of a different perspective. And that's all early on in Romanticism. The early Romantics, like from England, were kind of crazy nut jobs, like Percy Bysshe Shelley and Lord Byron. But later on, it kind of morphed into the whole Victorian Renaissance, the Catholic revival in England, for example. Okay, so anyways, that's a powerful quote, though. What is classical is healthy. What is romantic is sick. When he was young, Goethe had also been part of that movement, the Sturm und Drang movement, Storm and Stress movement, which is also a little bit of a male youth movement in revolt against what they felt was the stuffiness of classicism, okay? Meaning too much emphasis on a dry perspective related to the ancient Greeks and Romans, okay? And by the way, too, when people sometimes say, the Italian Renaissance was this big throwback to the ancient Greeks and Romans, and yes, it is true, that is part of it, but that largely came out of the Medicis. Most of the Italian art from the 1400s and the 1500s was dramatically, intensely, devoutly religious. It was much more Catholic than is widely given credit for if you actually look at the art from that time. Just remember, guys like Botticelli, the greatest artist of the 1400s from Italy, he actually burned some of his paintings because he was so intensely religious and carried away by the speeches of Savonarola and the bonfire of the vanities, okay? Just for a little perspective there. All right, next quote by Goethe. In the end, we retain from our studies only that which we practically apply. So that's a good quote. If you think something's important and useful and you want to keep that information, I recommend whenever I learn something good, like I'm at the hospital and I see an interesting case, I get an idea about it or I look something up on it, I pick up the phone and I call one of my friends and I talk about it with them because I know it's good for them to know about the case, but I know for my own benefit, if I have that conversation, I'm much more likely to remember that well for the next time around. And this quote right here, in the end, we retain from our studies only that which we apply. So you got to not just learn the knowledge, you have to use it for some purpose, to teach, to help somebody, whatever, to write, a book chapter or something. In addition, I like the quote by Ezra Pound where he said, only emotion endures. And so what I'm trying to say is, it's good to look for an emotional connection to something. And helping another person with that information, that's an emotional connection. Having a conversation with somebody is an emotional connection. But these are ways you maintain long-term retention of complex material. You have to talk about it with other people. It's good to seek out an opportunity to give a presentation, to teach about it, or be a tutor. For example, when I was in med school, second year, I would tutor the first years. And that was good for me to review all that first year material. So I was conversant in it. Not simply able to recognize it on a Scantron test, but conversant in it. Okay, Goethe, if you wish to advance into the infinite, explore the finite in all its directions. So what that basically means, that's a lot like John Stuart Mill. To learn a study, you must study it from all angles. And I do think that's pretty much what you should do. Study the converse opinions. Don't just study conventional opinion, because conventional opinion is often part of a power structure. And whoever controls the system wants it to be the way it is because they benefit from that and prestige or money. So read other books. Like when I want to read about a disease, I'll read the conventional perspective, then I'll try to read papers about it, And then sometimes I'll read patient books about how I healed myself from whatever disease. And a lot of those books are stupid and crazy, but sometimes they're great. And then the best is when I can find some old guy who studied it for many years and ready to retire and doesn't give a rat's ass, and he tells you the truth. Because, usually younger people are in the healthcare medical research world, they're chicken shits because they're always afraid of getting in trouble or offending their funders, so they won't get more money. Whereas an old guy, he's ready to retire, he's pissed off, he never got the credit he deserves, so he tells you everything. Those are the best books, those legacy books. Okay, next quote from Goethe. The earlier a man becomes aware that there exists some craft, some art that can help him towards a heightening of his natural abilities, the happier he is. The best genius is that which absorbs everything within itself, knows how to appropriate everything, enhancing and improving them throughout as much as possible. Yeah, so I was a little bit pissed off at my parents, instead of putting me through this stupid public schools, why didn't they send me to an art teacher, learn how to draw? Okay, why didn't I learn piano? I actually took clarinet lessons, which I hated. But man, do I wish I had learned how to draw. That would have been so valuable. My mother was fluent in Spanish from Puerto Rico. She's off the boat. But initially it was frowned on, and I wish I had learned it, from birth. Later on, I would talk to her, but my Spanish, it was functional, but it was never great like somebody who learns from birth. I could have had so much fun with that. A lot of things like that. So it's good to expose a person to a lot of things and expose them to things they can do all your life. You can draw all your life. You can play tennis all your life. I liked being a wrestler, and that was good for me. Kept me out of trouble, but I wish I did those other things. Okay, Goethe. A teacher who can arouse a feeling for one single good action, for one single good poem, accomplishes more than he who fills our memory with rows and rows of natural objects classified with name and form. Yeah, that's how most biology was. It's just memorizing all this stuff for the test, and do you really know it? Much better to get out in the woods with binoculars, bird watching, with somebody a little older who knows more, and you talk about everything. Also, what he's saying here is something that you use in your life that's more valuable to you. I actually think in chemistry classes, you should be filtering water. You should be testing the water from people's houses and discussing what's in the water and discussing the significance of the potassium, the calcium, the sodium. That would make inorganic chemistry so much fun, so interesting. And you would learn the toxicology of the water. That would be useful. All the rest of your life, you would have conversations about filtering water, the different ions, and the significance of the ions. That would make it useful. The way stuff is taught in high school and college, it's almost guaranteed to be a waste of time. Only the best teachers go beyond that. Okay, let's see. Goethe says, the artist, and that also reminds me of the quote by Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer said, when you see the man of learning, the academic, the professor, and you compare him with the amateur scholar who wants to master the field, the professor will describe all the parts of something, and it's as if like an artist's palette, all the colors, if you're lucky, they'll be systematically arranged, but they're still not connected to anything, and it still doesn't make any sense. Versus, he says, the amateur, it'll be like he's made a painting, and everything is connected and coherent and goes together, it makes a story, and it's memorable and understandable. And okay, Goethe's next quote. The artist may well be advised to keep his work to himself until it is completed, because no one can readily help him or advise him with it. But the scientist is wiser to share all of his findings for discussion. Yeah, I think the big pitfall of so-called being an artist is that if somebody starts discussing what they're doing before it's ready, they'll often sometimes get lazy, almost as if they feel like they've achieved the goal already by having the pleasure of discussing it, rather than keeping it to themselves until it's done. Like if I'm trying to write a book, I usually won't discuss it with anybody unless they can teach me something about it. And I won't even tell them I'm writing a book. I'll just discuss the topic with them, because then you got to get a high energy level. That's a lot of where it comes from. Writing a book is just you got to learn the material real well. Got to keep it clear in your head. Get your energy up and go. So you got to create the right conditions for that. Goethe, create, artist, do not talk. Oh yeah, and that's a little bit funny. So if you go to a lot of these writing sites, I enjoy listening to the different writers talk about writing. The funny thing is they'll say the writers who post the most on social media are the ones who write the least, or least likely to complete their project. I thought that was a little funny. Goethe, nothing is more damaging to a new truth than an old error. Yeah, and what I've seen is the old error has power behind it. It's the establishment. The establishment doesn't want new people coming along with a new way of doing things, and they would have to relearn it. They'd be dethroned from their prestige. And one of the typical things you'll see, in the modern world, almost everything sucks because this liberalism has destroyed almost everything it puts its hands on. Okay, the left is evil. It's like the devil. All right, but even in the old days, lots of stuff was still screwed up. And I told you about the great English teacher who was coming up with a new rhetoric, Christensen, Francis Christensen. And what he said was he was a sort of a prestigious, PhD professor of English literature and teaching writing classes and stuff and grammar at the college level, UCLA, I think it was. And he came to the conclusion, oh my gosh, English teachers don't understand English language and they don't know how to write. And the reason was, it's kind of like Spanish. You learn Spanish from communication, from talking to people, from reading books in Spanish, listening to Spanish music. You don't learn Spanish from grammar questions. That's part for touching up the nuance, but the real language is learned by, like a kid learns it, he never opens a book. Okay, so the English teachers, they could correct a grammar class, they could diagram a sentence, but they really couldn't write any compelling prose. Okay, and then he went through all the author's books and started studying it, and he found that they needed to use a lot more modifiers in their sentence structure. Okay, we're not going to get into that right now, but it was really interesting stuff. I made a video about it, Francis Christensen. Okay, Goethe. Oh yeah, so anyways, the old error will not allow you in. Like I said, conventional medicine won't allow me to talk about nutrition or any of this stuff. I'm like light years ahead of internal medicine doctors, but they would never, ever invite me to talk about these things in here. Okay, we talked about that before. And that's pretty much how it is. There's like a monopoly. Bad information has money behind it, and it monopolizes field after field after field, and it will not allow the truth to come in. So those fairy tales where the truth always wins out, that's not how it is in the real world. In the real world, usually a lie wins out with big money backing it. Okay, and only the people that really want the truth, that strongly seek it, can find the truth, because to the masses, the truth is hidden. Okay, Goethe's next quote. The deed is everything, the glory is nothing. That sounds nice, and it's nice to do stuff and get stuff done, but in reality, it's nice to get credit too. And a lot of times, the person who gets the credit is the person who has a big megaphone and can put a big voice behind something that they do. Okay, like for example, if you go to Amazon, I've written tons of books, almost 30 books. I have no way to advertise them or publicize them. So my books will have hardly any reviews, hardly any readers, but my book will usually, my earlier books, some of them were baby books. I was sort of figuring out how to do it all. But my later books are usually the best thing ever written in their genre. And, I'll get, 2 reviews, 5 reviews, okay? Because I have no way to advertise. And also because Christians are kind of lazy and stupid. A great Christian writer comes along like me, a Christian genius, I get almost no support. Whereas some other ethnic groups, somebody from their ethnic group writes a book, boom, they'll have 100 reviews like that. Okay, but that's also why Christians are so weak in the world, despite the fact they're 2.3 billion. They're the biggest religion in the whole world, but they're very weak as a group because they're all kind of isolated. They're often petty and jealous and not paying attention to things, or functional illiterates. It's just how it is. Okay, next quote of Goethe. To measure up to all that is demanded of him, a man must overestimate his capacities. Of course, I would never do that. Okay, let's see where we're at, what we got left here. We got a couple more. Goethe. The greatest happiness for the thinking man is to have fathomed the fathomable. Yeah, and that's a little bit like what Aristotle would say. The greatest of all pleasures is contemplation. Unlike the other pleasures, it does not wax and wane. You can only make the two-backed beast for a couple of minutes, okay? You can enjoy thinking all day long. Goethe continues, the highest happiness of man is to have probed what is knowable. Yeah, that's just sort of like, coming from German, there's different translations of the same quote, but it's fun. It's like an adventure to dig through a topic and figure out a topic. Okay, Goethe. What you can dream, you can do. Begin it. Boldness has genius and power and magic in it. Seize this very minute. Begin it and the work will be completed. Yeah, the hardest thing is getting started. So you have to see it in your mind's eye what you're going to do and then go for it. And that's also why it's so important to read history and to read about great achievements. Like if you want to be a painter, you should study the great painters. You should try to imitate their styles, their work, and gradually add to that yourself. but it really helps you to know about it. Like, for example, I wanted to write books many years ago, and I had written some before that. I wrote some books in med school, but I was just so busy. I'd be coming home from the hospital 7 o'clock at night. I was covering 3 hospitals initially in my career as a surgeon, and I just didn't have time. And I'm like, how am I ever going to make time to write these books I want to write? And I would read about, Robert Pirsig, who wrote Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, a masterpiece. And he wrote that while he was working full time. He would go to bed at 8 o'clock in the morning, wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and start writing until he'd have to go to work in the morning. And he just did that until he finished the book, and it was a masterpiece. And I'm like, wow, he could do that. I could do something like that. And I started doing things like that to create time to write. Okay, Goethe. Enthusiasm is of the greatest value. Higher aims are in themselves more valuable, even if unfulfilled, than lower ones, even if attained. That's why, I think it's good to have a high goal. Have a good high long-term goal, whatever it might be, and then, you have your short-term goals because you got to keep pushing yourself in the short term. But having that high goal in the distance, it motivates you to just work harder and do great things. And that's actually, I think, where I screwed up in my wrestling career. I sort of became a little disillusioned, and I would then have lower goals. Well, I just hope I win this tournament, or I just hope I'm an All-American. Versus like the Schultz brothers, they were like, national championship, I should own that. World championship, I should own that. Olympic champion, I should own that. And what I'm saying is, if you made it your goal to be an Olympic champion, you're probably going to be an All-American for sure. Dan Gable had said he lost that one match in the NCAAs his senior year. He's very pissed off about that. So he wanted to make sure he wins the Olympics. So he said the way he knew he could make sure he would win the Olympics if he made it his goal to be the best wrestler in the world in any weight class. This is Dan Gable from Iowa. And he said as he was trying to become the best wrestler in the world in any weight class, he got a lot better. And nobody scored a single point on him in the Olympic Games. So that sort of thing helps. And you got to have enthusiasm to generate that energy. Like I said, you got to be a maniac if you want to be really great at something, so you can generate all this energy to do all this work in that field and to push through the tedium, push through the boring plateau phases, which you have to go through before you break up to a higher level of skill, talent, achievement, presentation. Goethe, okay, last quote for today. Whatever good results I find in my reflections, they come to me when I am walking. Okay, now that quote, I've got it in there, but that sounds a little bit like a Nietzsche quote. And there are other persons who like to walk a lot and think. Beethoven liked to go for long walks. As a matter of fact, there's a funny story about Beethoven. I have the picture of it somewhere, the painting of it. Beethoven going for a walk with Goethe. And some of the fans were like yelling out to them, "Hey, Beethoven!" And, Goethe said, Goethe, who was also very famous, but not as famous as Beethoven in that context, said, "Isn't that annoying? Don't these people bother you?" And Beethoven said, just be quiet. They're only talking to me. They're not talking to you. Beethoven was super arrogant, but he was magnificent, of course, also. Another interesting thing, too. I heard a quote talking about Goethe's Faust, which is a rather bizarre piece of literature. There's the great scholar Faust, who in a sense is really Goethe himself, who's frustrated with all this academic stuff and seeks to enjoy life more, okay? And it had been said that his Faust, there's part one is sort of a local German literature sort of thing where he seduces the lady Gretchen and a chaos that Faust creates with that. He wants to have sex with her. Her mother's watching on them, so he says pour some sleeping pills into her drink, and then she dies, the girl's mother. And then he seduces Gretchen, and her brother who comes back from the army, and he's pissed off at Faust, and Faust kills her brother. Okay, and so the whole story is like insane. And she gets pregnant, he abandons her. Then the baby's born, she commits infanticide with the baby. She doesn't know what to do with it. She goes crazy. It's a little bit like Ophelia and Hamlet. And what I'm trying to say is the whole thing's kind of insane. But the way that had been described by Michael Sugrue, he said the Faust literature is so unique and so different. It was kind of like Beethoven's Ninth Symphony was to music, is what Goethe's Faust was to literature. It was this bizarre, but yet incredible in some ways thing. I actually think it's a little bit overrated, but there's still a lot of interesting that comes out of it. That was part one, the affair with Gretchen and the local German issues. And that one came out early. I think it was officially published in 1808, but it was done much before that. And then the latter part, he worked on it all his life, came out around the 1830s. That was Faust Part 2. That's the one where he seduced Helen of Troy, had a baby with her. But he later on reconciles with Gretchen, and Gretchen and him, go to heaven. But we're not going to get into any more today. But anyways, walking is good for everybody. You get good ideas when you walk. Of course, you get them. It's good to have like a piece of paper in your house, in your car, so when the idea comes to you, you write it down right away. Because a lot of times you wake up in the morning, write it down as soon as you can. Right when you get out of the shower, write it down. Anyways, hope that was helpful.